do now or in the future. Clayton and her team have followed up on these experiments, with others strongly suggesting that the scrub jays also seem capable of some degree of planning, or at least forethought, providing them with flexibility to act in the present in such a way as to boost their future chances of survival. To probe whether scrub jays may plan for the future, Clayton and her colleagues housed 8 jays in large cages with access to 2 different compartments. The first compartment always held breakfast, and the second compartment did not. The birds went without food overnight, and then in the morning were moved to one of the 2 compartments. After 3 mornings of exposure to each compartment, the birds were given food in the evening, pine nuts, which they were allowed to eat their fill of, and then store the surplus in either compartment. The jays cached their nuts in the breakfast room, presumably in anticipation of their hunger there the next morning. The researchers then added a twist. They offered the jays different foods in each compartment, peanuts in one, and dog kibble in the other. This time, when the birds cached their surplus, they distributed the food so that each room had equivalent offerings. In subsequent experiments on Eurasian jays, Clayton and her colleague Lucy Cheek showed that the birds store the specific food they will want in the future, apparently planning for their impending needs while ignoring their current desires. Whether jays pre-experience the future remains an open question, write the researchers, but our results provide strong evidence that they can act for a future motivational state that is different from their current one, and do so flexibly. This work suggests that some birds, at least, seem capable of the 2 essential components of mental time travel: the ability to peer back into the past and forward into the future, once considered unique to humans. But back to the spatial genius of Western scrub jays. There's more. As we know, scrub jays steal one another's caches. Remarkably, cachers can recover caches that have been moved and those that haven't with equal precision. A thieving jay, for its part, exploits some sophisticated mental mapping of his own. It relies on spatial memory to locate the food it witnessed being cached by another bird, and it can recall the particular spot even if it's watching from a distance and has to mentally rotate the location in its head. Hummingbirds appear to possess a similar small-scale navigational genius. Each spring my friend David White hangs a nectar feeder on a bungee cord with an shaped hook in his yard in central Virginia. Between seasons he takes down the feeder so the raccoons don't get it, but leaves the cord and hook so he can easily hang it up again come April. Sometimes he forgets to reinstall the feeder. But to his delight, the ruby-throated hummingbirds remind him, showing up around April 13th. A day or 2 before he usually rehangs the feeder, and hovering around the empty hook. The hummers know where to be, and when. I've watched these nectarivories whiz through my window boxes in spring, shuttling back and forth between flowers like whirring tops, energy made visible, their wings a gauzy blur. A ruby-throated hummingbird weighs about 3 grams, less than an old penny. The rubies that thrum and pivot around my plants seem not to buzz the same blossom twice. Does this mean they carry a map in their heads of the flowers they recently emptied and those that still carry nectar? Keeping in mind the handful of blossoms in my window box is one thing. Remembering the thousands of flowers that make up a typical territory for a hummingbird is another. But it makes sense that these birds would devote brainpower to this sort of energy-saving strategy. Hummingbirds lead very energetically expensive lives. Not only does their rapid wing beat of up to 75 times a second suck up calories, so do their high-speed chases of rivals and their diving, waggling, zigzagging shuttle flights to attract mates. To fuel their air derbies, they have to harvest hundreds of flowers per day. They don't want to waste a dime visiting blossoms they've already sucked dry. So they keep track. And they do it, apparently, not on the basis of color or shape or other visual tips offered by the flowers themselves, but rather through spatial cues, as food-storing jays and nutcrackers do. Sue Healy of the University of St. Andrews probes the cognitive abilities of hummingbirds in the wild. She studies the Rufus hummingbird, a tiny bright orange bird known for its feisty, pugnacious defense of the flowers on which it feeds. Healy's recent work suggests that these pennyweight wonders can register the spatial location of a flower or feeder in a large featureless field by visiting it once for only a few seconds. And they can return to that location with impressive accuracy, even if the flower itself is absent. Moreover, they keep track of the nectar quality and content of individual flowers and their refill rates, revisiting blooms only after the flowers have had time to restock. It's still a mystery what spatial cues they use to zero in on their quarry. Healy's research suggests that they rely on landmarks as a kind of scaffold for their mental map, as food-caching birds seem to do. But it's not a simple matter. In Healy's observations, nearby landmarks were remarkably uniform, the ground was quite flat and covered by vegetation. The more distant landmarks, however, trees rimming the field, 3,000-foot mountains framing the valley, were very visible from all points in the field. But it's not clear how the birds could use such large landmarks to so accurately pinpoint where particular flowers or feeders are, or where they should be. Scientists have assumed that homing pigeons possess maps like these in their heads, dotted with different memorized locations, just on a bigger geographical scale. But no one had really tested the idea outside the laboratory until recently, when Nicole Blaser devised an inspired experiment. Blaser wanted to show that pigeons navigate not by means of a simple, robotic response to environmental cues, but rather with the help of a genuine navigational map in their brains, which allows them to choose different goals and the best routes to reach them. If a pigeon is a sort of flying robot, navigation should be a relatively simple two-step process. Compare an environmental cue such as a magnetic signal at an unfamiliar location with the same cue at a familiar one, like the home loft. Then move in a direction that systematically reduces the gradational difference between the two cues. This robotic loftocentric strategy, as Blaser calls it, would mean that the birds memorize only one location, then navigate back to it following various gradient differences in environmental cues until they reach home. How to show that pigeons carry in their heads a genuine map of multiple locations. Blaser decided to give a flock of 131 pigeons a choice of where to fly, to a home loft or to a food loft, based on how hungry they were. First, she trained all of her pigeons to recognize the location of a food loft. Every day, she ferried them by car to the food loft for regular feedings. Then she released them from their home loft at gradually greater distances from the food loft, and vice versa, until they could fly efficiently from one loft to the other. After the training, she took them to a completely unfamiliar place equidistant from both lofts. Within 20 miles she fed half the pigeons, the other half she left hungry. Then she released all the pigeons. Those with full bellies flew back to the home loft, but the hungry ones made for the food loft. They detoured only to get around topographical obstacles, 2 lakes and a mountain range, then corrected their courses. Not one hungry pigeon traveled by way of the home loft. If the birds were navigating with a robotic loftocentric strategy, says Blaser, they would have oriented homeward first until they reached familiar terrain, then changed their flight path toward the food loft. Flying directly to the spot that will satisfy their hunger is revealing on 2 counts, says Blaser. First, it shows that the birds are capable of making choices between targets according to motivation, a cognitive ability in and of itself, and also that they're holding in their heads a genuine cognitive map, which includes knowledge of their own unfamiliar position in space relative to at least 2 known places. Where in the diminutive landscape of a pigeon brain could such a map reside? In the same place it lives in our brain, the hippocampus, that neuronal network that helps us orient in space. We know this thanks in part to the effort of one tall maniac, anatomist John O'Keefe, who won the 2014 Nobel Prize for a remarkable discovery while doing his own maze studies with rats in the 1970s. In studying brain activity during the rat's maze running, O'Keefe and psychologist Lynn Nadell observed that certain special cells in the hippocampus fired only when the rats were in a specific place. As a rat meandered through a maze, these place cells fired in a spatial pattern that precisely matched the rodent's zigzagging path. In our brains, the hippocampus is a seahorse-shaped structure buried deep within the medial temporal lobe. A bird's hippocampus sits on top of the brain like a button or a little toadstool. But in both bird and boy, this whiff of tissue harbors our mental maps and our memories. In fact, our recollections appear to be all bound up with where we experienced an event. New research shows that when we recall an event, the place cells in our hippocampus that store the location of that event fire again, helping us to locate a memory in both space and time. This explains why retracing your steps can help you remember what you were looking for. Your memory of a thought is married to the place in which it first occurred to you. In birds, the hippocampus plays a critical role in processing spatial information. A bigger hippocampus generally means better spatial ability. Families of food-caching birds have a hippocampus more than twice the size expected for birds of their brain size and body weight. For instance, in relative terms, a chickadee hippocampus is 2 times bigger than a sparrow's. Hummingbirds can really crow in this respect. Relative to their whole brain size, they have a bigger hippocampus than any other bird, 2 to 5 times larger than that of caching and non-caching songbirds, seabirds, and woodpeckers. 1 big hummingbird, known as the long-tailed hermit, has a brain only as big as that of an American redstart but boasts a hippocampus almost 10 times larger, the better to remember the location, distribution, and nectar content of the gingers and passion flowers it feeds on in Venezuela and Brazil. Brood parasites such as honeyguides and cowbirds also have a big hippocampus compared with non-parasitic birds in the same family. This makes sense, says Louis Lefebvre. A honeyguide has to find a suitable nest to drop her eggs into at just the right time. If she puts them in a nest where chicks will be hatching the next day, her babies will be bumped off as runts. If she drops it in too early, the host bird may not be ready to lay or incubate. So she has to monitor the position of nests and the stages they're in. Female cowbirds have a larger hippocampus than males, and, as Melanie Gageno and her colleagues at the University of Western Ontario recently found, they also have more spatial prowess. In most animals, it's the males who have superior spatial abilities, but in birds, brood parasites upend this stereotype. Only female cowbirds locate, monitor, and revisit the nests they parasitize. They search the canopy and watch nest-building activity to spot host nests. Then, before sunrise, they locate the nests in the dark and lay their eggs there. In a laboratory study, Gageno found that female cowbirds were far more adept at spatial memory tasks than their male counterparts. This suggests that superior spatial ability is not inherently male, but evolves in relation to the ecological demands of the brood parasitic way of reproducing. Homing pigeons have a heftier hippocampus than other pigeon strains bred for their fancy features, such as fantails, pouters, and strassers. But this hippocampal prowess is not genetic. It's hard-earned. Not long ago, a clever experiment revealed that the size of a homing pigeon's hippocampus depends upon its use. Scientists raised 20 homing pigeons in the same loft near Dusseldorf, Germany. After the birds fledged, half were allowed to fly around and learn the location of their loft and its surroundings. They also participated in several races of distances up to 175 miles. The other 10 birds were confined to a loft spacious enough for the birds to fly around in freely, so they got roughly the same amount of physical activity as their more liberated counterparts, but not the navigational practice. When all the birds had reached sexual maturity, the scientists measured the volume of their brains and their hippocampi. Those pigeons with experience navigating had a hippocampus more than 10% larger than the inexperienced birds. It's not clear what biological mechanism is responsible for the ballooning, say the scientists. Existing cells could increase their cell body size, they speculate, or new supporting brain cells could be added, or there could be increased vascularization. In any case, the size of a pigeon's hippocampus may reflect experience and how often its navigational skills are called up. In other words, it may be shaped by use. British researchers discovered that this appears to be true for humans, too, in a now famous study of some highly skilled modern navigators, London cabbies. Before aspiring cab drivers can get an operating license in London, they must pass a stringent exam known as the Knowledge. This involves memorizing the spatial layout of some 25,000 streets, as well as thousands of landmarks, in what has been deemed by popular survey, the world's most confusing city. Mastering knowledge of London's Byzantine byways takes 2 to 4 years. The scientists found that cabbies who have been driving for a number of years have more gray matter in the rear portion of their hippocampus, compared with cabbies who are still green or London bus drivers. This raises a troubling question. If our human navigational efforts shape our hippocampus, what happens when we stop using it for this purpose? When we lean too hard on technology such as GPS, which makes navigation a brain-free endeavor. GPS replaces navigational demands with a very pure form of stimulus response behavior. Some scientists fear that overdependence on this technology will shrink our hippocampus. Indeed, when researchers at McGill University scanned the brains of older adults who used GPS and those who didn't, they found that the people accustomed to navigating on their own had more gray matter in the hippocampus and showed less overall cognitive impairment than those who relied on GPS. As we lose the habit of forming cognitive maps, we may be losing gray matter. We know where a bird's mental map likely resides. But how big can it be? I'm thinking about this one early October morning on the beach at Cape Henlopen, Delaware. The day has dawned cold. Water temperatures are plummeting. On the bay side of the cape, I'm hoping to glimpse an osprey. But the big birds are mostly gone, headed south to Peru or Venezuela to winter in the warm swamps of the Amazon. However, it's still peak migratory season for some raptors, along with the songbirds they feed on. Across the Delaware Bay at Cape May, merlins are moving through, along with kestrels, peregrine falcons, sharp-shinned hawks, and Cooper's hawks, pausing to pluck small birds from their journeys to sustain themselves during their own travels. The little brown jobs are at Cape May in abundance. In the brushy areas of Hidden Valley and the farmland known as the Beanery are a glister of goldfinches and yellow-rumped and palm warblers, along with some late parulas, black poles, and red-eyed vireos. A cold front can push tens or even hundreds of thousands of migratory songbirds through this area at one time, a wondrous sight if you happen to be watching from the dike at Higbee Beach. These neotropical migrants will rest and feed for a few days and then launch back into the night. I love to imagine autumn's night sky sprinkled with dark southbound birds. As I round Henlopen to the ocean side of the cape, a thick bank of fog hovers off the coast. I watch it with curiosity for a moment as it rolls closer, like a giant gray wave. Suddenly it enfolds me in a blanket of salt damp. The dunes along the shore melt into mist, and I can't see 3 feet in front of me. It's strangely disorienting, but that's all. I can easily trace the shoreline and find my way back through the dunes. It's a different matter being in fog at sea. John Huth, a physics professor at Harvard University, tells the story of setting off in his kayak into Nantucket Sound on a clear day at this very time of year. Without warning, he became engulfed in dense fog. A veteran kayaker, Huth had been careful to note important cues before he left, especially the direction of wind and waves. I stayed close to the shore, he writes, and any time the fog obliterated landmarks, I knew how to turn toward land. 2 other kayakers paddling nearby that day were not so fortunate, they apparently lost. As Huth points out, early human navigators could read natural cues to find their way. Polynesian voyagers created a natural compass by remembering the positions of rising and setting stars. Arab traders used the smell and feel of winds to traverse the Indian Ocean. The Vikings used the position of the sun to determine time and orientation. Navigators of the Pacific Islands read the waves. With learning, we can find our way through close observations of sun, moon, and stars, tides and currents, wind and weather. But without a map or GPS on hand, most modern humans are hopeless at navigating. Birds migrating in the ocean of air, on the other hand, rarely lose their way, even in darkness or fog. Like pigeons, they rely on available compass cues from visual landmarks, the sun, and magnetic fields. At night, some use the stars, but not in the way you might think. They carry no map of star patterns but learn the apparent rotation of the night sky around the North Star. In the first summer of their lives, fledglings search the starry night sky for its center of rotation. In the northern hemisphere, this rotational center is the North Star, which birds learn to interpret as north. They orient themselves away from the star to head south. Once their stellar compass is fully established, birds can orient by the stars even if only some are visible. I know that navigating by celestial cues is not necessarily a sign of high intellect. After all, dung beetles, best known for sculpting little balls of animal feces that they later eat, use light from the Milky Way to orient themselves at night. Still, it seems a marvel to me that birds can glean a north-south orientation by learning the rotational patterns of stars. Migrating birds do occasionally get thrown off course hundreds or even thousands of miles by natural events such as storms. These are, in a way, natural displacement experiments on a grand scale. The ability of most migrants to find their way back to their target goal after such disorienting dislocations suggests that their mental maps may be very big indeed. I had hoped to visit Cape Henlopen a year earlier, but my plans were foiled by Hurricane Sandy. Just a day or two before my scheduled arrival that year, the superstorm was barreling up from the south. Its eye aimed straight at the Cape. I'm glad I didn't brave it. The hurricane hit Henlopen dead-on, swamping roads and destroying bridges, piling sand into parking lots and side streets. After Sandy passed, the whole eastern edge of the continent was swarming with vagrants. It's an interesting term, commonly used for someone who travels idly with no means of support. The word comes from the Latin root vagare, meaning to wander. A vagrant bird that has wandered or been blown off course is by its very nature unusual, and draws a twitch of birders keen on spotting that odd bird out of place, a quick addition to the life list. In the wake of Sandy, birdwatchers at Cape May reported seeing more than 100 Pomeranian Jaegers, predatory seabirds that were likely blown inland while migrating south from their nesting grounds in the Arctic to winter in tropical seas. Hundreds more were spotted as far inland as Pennsylvania, flying south along the Susquehanna River. Sooty terns, red phalaropes, a Sabine's gull, a Corey's shearwater, and a tropic bird all ended up in Manhattan. A scattering of northern lapwings, European shorebirds, turned up in the open fields along New England coasts. And a Trinidad petrel, a deepwater bird that normally spends its days over the open Atlantic Ocean off Brazil, dropped down near Altoona, Pennsylvania, west of the Appalachian Mountains and 200 miles from the coast. It wasn't there for long though. After the wind died down, the bird headed south. If you want to add an accidental to your life list, you have to act quickly. Usually they're on their way within a day, apparently knowing just which way to go. That experimental shuttling of white-crowned sparrows from the Pacific Northwest to Princeton, New Jersey, was a more extreme version of Hurricane Sandy, a deliberately massive displacement experiment. The scientists who conducted it were hoping to shed light on the size of a bird's navigational map, and they did. That the sparrows could so quickly adjust and correct their course after a 3,000-mile displacement suggested the existence of a vast mental navigational map encompassing at least the continental United States, and possibly the globe. The experiment also suggested that the map is experience-based. The young, completely inexperienced birds in the experiment did not fare so well. They failed to find their way back across the country and instead, guided by instinct alone, just flew south. Birds are not born with their maps. They learn them. Some do so by following the routes of the adult birds around them, whooping cranes, for instance. Inexperienced hoopers shadow adults along migration routes, which is why scientists can train naive captive hoopers to follow a microlight aircraft as if it were an avian Pied Piper. But trailing a parent is not always possible. A fledgling puffin, for example, leaves the isolated North Atlantic cliff slopes and islands of its birth at night, well before adults leave the colony for the winter. Likewise, a young cuckoo doing the English season in Norfolk can't follow his parents to the rainforests of the Congo, because they have already gone south before he has fledged from the nest of his foster parents. Still, a young migratory bird somehow manages to find its way hundreds or thousands of miles to its wintering grounds, though it has never been there before. To do so, it relies on a bit of wondrous genetic intelligence, an innate clock and compass program that tells it to fly for a certain number of days in a certain direction. The clock is an internal timekeeper under genetic control that dictates the number of flying days. We know this because a caged migratory bird will demonstrate a set amount of migratory restlessness, the Zugunruhe, which is tightly correlated with the distance it usually migrates. As for the compass piece, at least some juvenile birds carry an inherited one-direction compass that's specific to their species and sets them on the proper course. To stay on that course, they rely on the compass cues adults use, including sun, stars, the geomagnetic field, and the polarized light cues available at sunset. It's hard to imagine how this innate program works, especially for birds with extremely precise and complex routes. But somehow, coded in their genes and passed from one generation to the next is species-specific information on both direction and distance. For the return trip and later migrations, birds no longer depend on inherited information. As they travel, they build a cognitive map that allows them to use true navigation to find breeding or wintering grounds they've visited before, and even to correct for displacements by wind, storm, and other natural events. For some birds, at least, this map in the head would appear to be immense, spanning continents and even oceans. Witness the white-crowned sparrow or the Manx shearwater. In 1. Displacement experiment with shearwaters, birds transported 3,200 miles to Boston from their nesting island in Wales found their way back home in just 12.5 days. What is this map made of? It may work like our Cartesian coordinate system, with different environmental cues that vary predictably along gradients providing information about latitude and longitude. To use these gradients, says Richard Holland of Queen's University, Belfast, a bird would have to learn that they vary predictably in intensity with space within their home range and extrapolate this beyond the learned area. But what are the sensory cues contributing to the map's coordinates? Does it even have coordinates? Despite a welter of studies over the past 4 decades, we're still trying to uncrumple the much crumpled matter of mapping cues. The gradient map may be partly geomagnetic. Holland and a colleague lately made a curious discovery. The pair picked up several European robins that had stopped over at a resting stage on their migratory path, and exposed them to a strong magnetic pulse, temporarily disrupting their magnetic sense. Then they let the birds go. The young robins seemed unbothered by the pulse and continued on their expected path, guided by their innate program. But the adults flew off in the wrong direction. The researchers speculated that the adult birds had built up magnetic maps in their heads during their migrations, which they used to help them navigate on subsequent journeys. The pulses may have reset those maps, confusing the birds. Another recent experiment, this one tinkering with Eurasian reed warblers, also points in this direction. A team led by Nikita Chernetsov and Henrik Muritsyn caught warblers on their migratory route north from Kaliningrad, Russia, on the Baltic Sea, to southern Scandinavia. In half the birds, the scientists cut the nerve that runs from beak to brain, the so-called trigeminal nerve, which is thought to transmit magnetic information to the brain. Then they displaced all the birds more than 600 miles to the east of their normal migratory path. The warblers with an intact beak-to-brain trigeminal nerve quickly reoriented toward the northwest and their normal breeding grounds. But the birds with a severed nerve headed northeast as if they were still on their normal migratory path. The remarkable thing was that the birds knew where north was, but they had lost their ability to fix their position. In other words, they appeared to have lost their map sense. We humans are highly visual creatures, especially when it comes to spatial matters. It's hard to wrap our minds around a map made of cues we can't see. Here's another one. According to John Hagstrom, a geophysicist at the U.S. Geological Survey who has studied bird navigation for more than a decade, natural infrasonic signals, low-frequency noises in the atmosphere beneath our range of hearing but perhaps audible to birds, may be part of a map that helps them find their way. It may also cue them to the arrival of storms. A startling example of the apparent ability of some birds to anticipate impending storms recently came to light by accident. It was April 2014, and researchers at the University of California, Berkeley, were testing whether a population of tiny golden-winged warblers breeding in the Cumberland Mountains of eastern Tennessee could carry geolocators on their backs. The birds had arrived only in the past day or two after a 3,000-mile journey north from their wintering grounds in Colombia. The team had just attached the gizmos to the tiny warblers when all the birds suddenly flew the coop, spontaneously, evacuating their nesting grounds. The scientists later learned that a huge supercell spring storm was headed their way, one that would spawn 84 tornadoes and kill 35 people. The warblers left 24 hours before the devastating storm hit and flew in all directions, some as far south as Cuba. After the storm passed, they flew straight back to their nesting site, for some, a round trip of almost 1,000 miles. The scientists conducting the study suggest that the birds may have been warned by the deep rumble of the superstorm, when it was still 250 to 500 miles away, picking up on the strong low-frequency infrasounds generated by such tornadic storms. These can travel for hundreds to thousands of miles but are inaudible to humans. Infrasounds are produced by many natural sources, but primarily by oceans. Interacting waves in the deep ocean and movement of sea surface water create a kind of background noise in the atmosphere that can be detected anywhere on Earth with the help of a low-frequency microphone. In addition, pressure changes on the seafloor generate seismic waves in the solid Earth that can interact with the atmosphere at the ground surface, like a giant speaker cone, says John Hagstrom, to produce infrasound waves that are radiated outward by hillsides, cliffs, and other steep terrain and can travel great distances. Each location on Earth possesses a kind of sound signature, then, shaped by topography. In Hagstrom's view, birds may use these sound signatures to navigate and to locate their lofts infrasonically. Similar to the way we see a landscape, I think birds are hearing it, says Hagstrom. Farther away, they are probably listening to the sounds produced by larger landscape features, and as they get closer the features get smaller. In other words, a pigeon may know just what the area around her loft sounds like. Pigeons with frosted lenses covering their eyes can return to within a kilometer or two of their loft but need to see it for their final approach, says Hagstrom. I think this is the smallest possible area that can produce infrasounds loud enough for a pigeon to hear. There are plenty of skeptics. The anecdotal evidence is certainly fascinating, says Henrik Moritzen, but the key question that needs to be answered by anybody suggesting infrasound as a bird orientation cue is sensory. Can birds sense infrasound at all? There's no evidence of this. And secondly, can they determine the direction it's coming from? This normally requires a very large distance between the ears, suggests Moritzen. In his view, a much more likely explanation for the ability of those warblers in Tennessee to detect that distant superstorm is not infrasound, but changes in atmospheric pressure, which birds are known to be able to sense. However, if Hagstrom's infrasound theory is true, it could shed light on the disappearance of whitetail and those 60,000 other pigeons that vanished from England and France almost 2 decades ago. Intrigued by the disappearance of so many pigeons in that disastrous race, Hagstrom dug around the historical records to see if any unusual sound events might have coincided with the race. Sure enough, there was a big one that day, just as the racing pigeons were heading out across the English Channel. Their flight route crossed paths with a Concorde SST just leaving Paris. When the plane went supersonic, says Hagstrom, it laid down a sonic boom carpet, so loud it obliterated the pigeons' navigational acoustic map, completely disorienting them. Hagstrom's idea may also help to explain certain Bermuda triangles of pigeon homing, places where pigeons tend to disappear or get hopelessly lost. The geometry of terrain in these spots may create what he calls sound shadows, which disrupt their acoustic bearings. The idea remains highly controversial. Says Richard Holland, these correlations are compelling, but they're just that, correlations. In the case of the pigeon race, a correlation between infrasonic disturbance and orientation disturbance. This is weak evidence, says Holland. No experiment has yet demonstrated any effects of infrasound on bird navigation. Imagination and inspires debate, though this theory is backed by substantial experimental evidence. The idea that odor cues might factor into bird navigation began more than 4 decades ago when Floriano Poppi conducted an experiment on pigeons in Tuscany. The Italian zoologist and his colleagues severed the olfactory nerves in a group of pigeons and released them at an unfamiliar site. The birds never returned, while their intact companions quickly flew back to the loft. At around the same time, German ornithologist Hans Wallraff found that pigeons at their home loft sheltered from the wind by glass screens were unable to find their way home. Thus was born the olfactory navigation hypothesis, which suggests that pigeons learn to associate the windborne smells of their home loft with wind direction and use this information to determine their way home. The possibility that birds navigate with the help of an odor map may shed light on a weird evolutionary paradox that scientists have puzzled over for more than a decade. It concerns a fluke in the geometry of animal brains. If you look at vertebrate brains across different orders, classes, families, and species, a neat pattern emerges, a kind of universal scaling law. In nearly all vertebrates, components of the brain, from the cerebellum to the medulla to the forebrain, scale up predictably with the size of the brain as a whole. More often than not, you can predict the size of the brain component from the total brain size. Structures in the brain that evolved more recently are usually bigger. Nature sometimes yields such lovely rules of thumb. However, the late equals large principle has one important exception, says Lucia Jacobs, a psychologist at the University of California, Berkeley, the olfactory bulb. It's a renegade in nearly every way. The olfactory bulb is an ancient part of the brain devoted to the sense of smell and found universally in vertebrates. It's often smaller than expected vis-a-vis the rest of the brain, or larger. And it varies in size across animals in the same order, the same class, or the same family. This is true for birds. Petrels and other seabirds such as shearwaters and albatrosses have bulbs roughly 3 times the size of those in songbirds. In the American crow, the bulb is only 5% of the length of the bird's cerebral hemisphere, whereas in the snow petrel, it's more than 35%. The largeness of the bulb in some birds has presented a conundrum. In the brain, big usually means important. It's called the principle of a proper mass. The more brain space devoted to a function, the greater its importance to the biology of the animal. But for a long time, scientists thought birds couldn't smell much. They didn't display any of the more obvious nose-inspired behaviors, sniffing butts or snuffling truffles. Birds were more like us, it seemed, eye-minded creatures with highly evolved and sophisticated visual systems. An extraordinary development of one set of organs is never accomplished, but at the expense of some other set, wrote one ornithologist in 1892. In this case, the organs of the sense of smell have been the martyrs. That view has radically changed. The shift began in the 1960s with experiments revealing that pigeons exposed to a stream of scented air showed a spike in heart rate. For their hearts to react this way, they had to be smelling something. Later, scientists planted electrodes in the birds' olfactory bulbs. To their surprise, they found the same pattern of cell firing in response to odor stimulation that occurs in the olfactory bulbs and nerves of mammals. Since then, nearly every species tested has demonstrated some olfactory talent, from cockapos and starlings to ducks and small petrels known as prions. Kiwis, flightless nocturnal birds of New Zealand, find their invertebrate feasts by tracking their scent through nostrils on their long beaks. Vultures are able to trace the odor of a decaying animal carcass miles away and approach it by flying upwind. Blue petrels, seabirds that forage over featureless waters for scattered krill, fish, and squid, can detect the odors of their prey even before they fledge, at minute concentrations. These petrels nest in dark burrows, and on moonless nights they appear to rely on scent to find their way back through dense colonies to their individual home burrows. All of these more obviously scent-oriented birds have big olfactory bulbs. But even species with much smaller bulbs, such as songbirds, appear to pluck odors from air, soil, and vegetation and use them to detect predators or plants protective against harmful microbes. Blue tits feeding their nestlings won't enter a nest box if it has been laced with the scent of a weasel. And they'll sniff out fresh yarrow, apple mint, and lavender, and fairy fragments to their nest cups to protect their chicks from pathogenic bacteria and parasites. Small seabirds called crested auklets don't let their modestly sized olfactory bulbs prevent them from plunging into an odorous social rite every summer, burying their noses in the napes of other auklets to scope out their scent, an aroma reported to smell like freshly peeled tangerines. Perceptible only in the breeding season but strong enough to be detectable even to human noses as far as a half-mile downwind. Zebra finches, whose bulbs are tiny indeed, use their sense of smell to spot their relatives, just as mammals do, to avoid inbreeding and facilitate cooperation with their kin. But why the wide variation in bulb size? Do the discrepancies just reflect differing demands for acute smell called for by different foraging pressures or social lifestyles? Lucia Jacobs has another explanation. A specialist in cognition and brain evolution, Jacobs proposes that the olfactory bulb first evolved in all vertebrates, including birds, not for hunting or foraging or ducking predators or communicating or finding mates, but rather, she says, for animals to decode and map patterns of odorants for the purpose of spatial navigation. The universe of smells is super dynamic, with constantly moving cues. It demands a neural architecture adapted to learning complex patterns, explains Jacobs. In fact, this could have been the primary driving force in the evolution of associative learning, Jacobs suggests, the ability to learn and remember the relationship between unrelated items, for example, the scent of a certain mineral or tree and the direction toward home. The size of the bulb in birds today correlates more tightly with their ability to navigate by olfactory cues than with their capacity to discriminate odors for food or protection against predators. The homing pigeon, for instance, has an impressively big olfactory bulb compared with its non-homing domestic pigeon cousins, which otherwise share its lifestyle. Certain birds with big olfactory bulbs do seem to possess some sort of detailed smell map. Anna Gagliardo of the University of Pisa has found that Cory's shearwaters, pelagic birds of the Atlantic Ocean, appear to use odor maps to find their way around the sea. Shearwaters wander the wide oceans searching for food, but each year they manage to find the same tiny island on which to breed and raise their young. To find out how they do it, Gagliardo and her colleagues removed 24 shearwaters from their nests on the Azores during nesting season, and loaded them onto a cargo ship headed to Lisbon. Some of the birds were fitted with small magnetic bars that scrambled their magnetic sense. Others had their nostrils washed with zinc sulfate, temporarily obliterating their sense of smell. Once the ship was hundreds of miles from the breeding island, the birds were released. Those with the mixed-up magnetics found their way back, but those with the neutralized noses were completely confused and meandered around the ocean for weeks. Some never returned to their islands. A navigational map of smells would not look like any bicoordinate map we've ever seen. Jacobs imagines a dual mapping system for olfactory space, based on the work of Poppy, Walraff, and other researchers. The first part is a low-resolution map made of various odor plumes that mix at different gradients to create a grid dividing olfactory space into subregions she calls neighborhoods. These odor plumes may consist of different ratios of so-called volatile organic compounds, chemicals in the atmosphere that may be the source of odors. When Walraff sampled air at 96 different sites within a 125-mile radius of a pigeon loft in southern Germany, he found that these ratios increased or decreased along fairly stable spatial gradients. For a pigeon, shifts in the ratios may translate into shifts in scent. In other words, different areas have different smells. Think of a pigeon in its home loft. There's a scent of lemon trees in one direction and the aroma of olive trees in the other. If the bird flies toward the lemon trees, the odor of lemons will grow stronger while the smell of olives will grow fainter. Drop a pigeon in a neighborhood somewhere in between, and from the particular mix of gradients it will glean information about the direction of home. The second part of the map is a collection of odorous landmarks, blends of odors unique or specific to a particular locale. Imagine an aromatic rendition of the Statue of Liberty or the Tower of London. This notion of an odor map is still a topic of hot debate, and there are significant problems with it. Odors are airborne and move with the winds. So it seems unlikely that smells would congeal to form any sort of stable bicoordinate map. Obviously, the question of turbulence looms large, says Jacobs. But birds and other animals are pretty good at decoding turbulence, she says. And as it turns out, the distribution of at least some odors in the atmosphere is fairly stable, creating predictable spatial gradients that might be useful for a bird navigating over distances of hundreds of miles, though probably not beyond that. To complicate matters, there's a possibility that odors may act more as motivational cues than as navigational ones. One study found that in young pigeons, odors appear to activate other navigational processes. If this study holds true, says Richard Holland, smelling the non-home odors may trigger a bird to access a navigation system based on other cues. Still, a recent experiment by Holland and his colleagues showed that adult catbirds, deprived of their sense of smell, and then displaced from Illinois to Princeton, New Jersey, were unable to correct for the displacement the way their counterparts with active noses could. Moreover, when scientists looked inside the brains of migratory birds during their Zugenruhe, they saw activity in both the visual and olfactory areas of the brain, suggesting that smell does indeed play a part in migratory behavior. It's just not clear what that role is. It's an intriguing idea, a mental map made up, at least in part, of mosaics of odors and curling signposts of smell. Jacobs believes birds may use the neighborhood system as a rough map to sort out their general position and determine flying direction. The landmark system would take time to learn but would ultimately yield a map of higher spatial resolution. In this scenario, then, olfaction may supply two kinds of mapping cues. Over evolutionary time, Jacobs suggests, the hippocampus became specialized to process and integrate these two olfactory information streams. Eventually, it learned to integrate other kinds of sensory cues, such as magnetic signals and sound. This might explain why the olfactory bulb is such an outlier when it comes to brain scaling. With the evolutionary shift in some species to the use of other sensory information for navigation, the olfactory bulb dwindled in size. I find it oddly thrilling that the mental maps of birds remain, well, unmapped. There's no clear evidence that any one sensory cue is the whole story. Which cues a particular bird uses on any particular journey may depend on the scale of the trip, or what's handy, or the environmental conditions, or simply its own individual. For instance, which cues a pigeon uses to home in on its loft may depend on its life experience and its own quirky choosing. In Blasser's study of homing pigeons, she found that the pigeons never beeline to their target. Each time, they took a slightly different route, a compromise between their chosen compass direction, topographic factors, and their own individual flight strategies, she says. A lot depends on how a pigeon grows up, and where. A pigeon raised in a loft without ambient odors orients using other cues and isn't affected when deprived of its sense of smell, according to Charles Walcott. Likewise, sibling pigeons raised in different lofts have different responses to magnetic anomalies. One finds its way despite the weird magnetic pattern, the other is bewildered by it and loses its sense of direction. Individual birds are also just eccentric and seem to use their orientation cues according to their own styles. Walcott tells the story of one pigeon raised near a prominent hill in Massachusetts. When released at an unfamiliar site, he always flew to the nearest mountain before flying home, unlike any of the other birds raised in his loft. Another pigeon was a champion distance navigator, but once he got within 6 miles of his loft, says Walcott, he just kind of gave up and landed in a garden somewhere. In this arena, as in all aspects of bird life, idiosyncrasy and opportunism may prevail. Like an executive who enjoys having 2 cell phones and a laptop tuned to the Weather Channel, a pigeon may rely on all kinds of available information for guidance. She may use multiple and redundant cues to find her way, and mental maps unlike anything we've ever encountered. Her spatial grid may not be bicoordinate at all, but multi-coordinate, layered with a still mysterious mix of sun, star, and geomagnetic cues, sound waves, and swirling signboards of smell, all thoroughly integrated. This notion seems to dovetail with a new theory about the overall organization of bird brains, and our own. In the lingo of neuroscience, brains are known as massively parallel, distributed control systems. Roughly speaking, that means that they contain a colossal number of little processors, neurons, that operate in parallel but are distributed all over. The problem in a brain, then, is how to pull together all those distributed resources, the totality of what an animal knows, to meet a challenge or respond to unpredictable circumstances. It's called cognitive integration. The brain of a bee, with only 1 million neurons, does it. So does the human brain, with its 100 billion neurons. Humans excel at cognitive integration, says Murray Shanahan, a computational neuroscientist at Imperial College London, although he admits that failures are commonplace, as when I remove the U-bend of my sink and then pour its dirty contents back into the plug hole, causing an unwelcome deluge. True navigation is a triumph of cognitive integration, says Shanahan. To achieve it, a certain pattern of connectivity in the brain is required. Information about landmarks, distances, spatial relations, memories, sights, sounds, and smells must all funnel into a core of important brain regions and then fan out between them. This, he explains, results in an integrated response to the ongoing situation. To figure out how this connectivity might work in a typical bird brain, Shanahan co-opted a team of neuroanatomists to analyze anatomical studies of pigeon brains. Drawing on more than 40 years' worth of studies tracing pathways between brain regions in pigeons, the team created the first large-scale map, or wiring diagram, of the pigeon brain, showing how different regions in a typical bird brain are connected to process information. The surprise? The map the team came up with looks a lot like such connectivity maps for mammals, including humans. Though birds have radically different brain architecture from ours, when it comes to connectivity, their brains seem to be organized in a similar fashion. Shanahan sees in the similarity what he calls a common blueprint for high-level cognition. In simplified terms, the human brain is thought to be a so-called small world network, not unlike Facebook. Different modules, or regions, of the brain are connected by a relatively small number of neurons known as hub nodes. These hub nodes connect with lots of other neurons, sometimes over long distances, to provide a short connective link between any two nodes in the network. The hub nodes linking parts of the brain important in cognition, such as long-term memory, spatial orientation, problem solving, together make up the brain's connective core. Shanahan found that the hub nodes in the pigeon's hippocampus, in particular, so crucial to navigation, had very dense connections to other parts of the bird's brain. The idea is this: if a migrating lapwing or reed warbler is blown halfway across the country by a storm, perhaps the information her senses gather from all of her sources. From the sense of land and sea, from magnetic signatures and anomalies. From the slant of sunlight and the starry pattern of night skies, all funnels into the connective core in her brain, where it's integrated and then fans out to the brain regions that will help guide her to her natal ground. In a bird brain, then, a small world network may create a big world map. So that a hummingbird can find her way to David White's feeder each spring. So that an Arctic tern can journey like a guided missile from one bright pole to the other. So that one cool April morning after being away for 5 years, Whitetail the racing pigeon can finally hightail it home. Sparrowville. Adaptive genius. It is not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent. It is the one that is the most adaptable to change. These words are often attributed to Charles Darwin, but they're actually from the pen of the late Leon Megginson, a professor of marketing at Louisiana State University. I'm reminded of the good professor's words early one May morning. A group of us has gathered for a spring bird count at the Crossroads Shopping Center in Albemarle County, Virginia. Our first birds, a common grackle, a house finch, and a family of house sparrows nesting above a sign that says Mom's Laundromat. We call them a parking lot of birds, says my birding friend David White. Where can you find a nesting sparrow? In the rafters of buildings and the clips holding gutter spouts to houses. In the ventilator holes beneath flat roofs, inside streetlights, in flower pots on your porch. Rarely far from any man-made structure. One family of sparrows nested for generations in a coal mine hundreds of feet underground, kept alive by the offerings brought by miners. I once found a sparrow's nest in the tailpipe of an abandoned Toyota sedan. What did these birds do before civilization, asks David. Passer domesticus. As its Latin name suggests, the house sparrow is the migrant's polar opposite. Like a pushy house guest, it's invited in, but often overstays its welcome. It's a permanent resident through most of its range, and remarkably sedentary, clinging to the locality of its chosen home, foraging close to roosting sites, breeding close to its natal colony. And yet the house sparrow's rapid spread around the globe is legendary. In his book Biology of the Ubiquitous House Sparrow, Ted Anderson cites a theory of the sparrow's origin that is revealing of its nature. The theory proposes that the bird was always an obligate commensal of sedentary humans. It came into its own as a species only since the advent of agriculture in the Middle East, approximately 10,000 years ago. Other theories place its origin earlier than that, more like 500,000 years ago, based on fossil evidence found in a cave near Bethlehem in Palestine. In any case, so highly skilled has the house sparrow become at adapting to any environment occupied by humans, that it has been called the ultimate opportunist, our avian shadow. Does the sparrow's knack for adapting to human habitats call for any special kind of smarts? What about birds that don't possess it? These are not casual questions. Birds are facing change on a scale unknown in their evolutionary history. This is a result of the Anthropocene, the new epoch of man-made change that is contributing to what has been called the sixth mass extinction. The habitats that birds have occupied for millions of years are going the way of croplands and cities and sprawling suburbs. Exotic species are displacing natives. Climate change is shifting the bands of rainfall and temperature that birds count on for feeding, migrating, and breeding. Many species don't tolerate these changes well. Some do. Pigeons, turtle doves, and other so-called synanthropes drawn to settle near humans. A set of mental skills that allows them to thrive in a place no matter how altered or degraded it may be. Or perhaps it's the other way around. Maybe the changes we're wreaking are changing the birds themselves, shaping the nature of their brains and behavior. Are we humans selecting for a certain breed of bird intelligence? A sparrow-like smartness? The ornithologist Pete Dunn calls Passer domesticus the sidewalk sparrow. Before 1850, there were no house sparrows in North America. Today there are millions. You have to hand it to them. The first 16 birds said to have been introduced to Brooklyn in 1851 to control a plague of moths may not have taken immediately to the New World, but another bigger shipment imported from England the following year did, and in a big way. The birds got some help from individuals and naturalization societies bent on populating their gardens and parks with plants and animals from the Old World, which no doubt accelerated their expansion. But even so, the success of their spread is staggering. The transplants found a land much to their liking, rich in grain and horse droppings. They multiplied and dispersed rapidly, spilling into farming districts, where they exploited every food source they could find: grains, small fruits, and succulent garden plants, such as young peas, turnips, cabbage, apples, peaches, plums, pears, and strawberries. Soon they were considered a serious pest. In 1889, just a few decades after the house sparrow's introduction, sparrow clubs were formed with the sole objective of destroying the birds, and county and state officials were offering 2 cents a head for each sparrow killed. Before long, the birds had spread across the United States and Canada, adapting to environments as extreme as Death Valley, California, at 280 feet below sea level, and the Colorado Rockies at more than 10,000 feet above sea level. They moved southward into Mexico, through Central and South America as far as Tierra del Fuego, and along the Trans-Amazonian Highway deep into the rainforests of Brazil. In Europe, Africa, and Asia, they dispersed to northern Finland, the Arctic, South Africa, and clear across Siberia. Now the humble house sparrow is the world's most widely distributed wild bird, with a global breeding population of some 540 million. It's found on every continent except Antarctica and on islands everywhere, from Cuba and the West Indies to the Hawaiian Islands, the Azores, Cape Verde, and even New Caledonia. Ted Anderson writes that he can sit in his living room listening to news reports from just about anywhere in the world on the radio or TV and hear the characteristic chirrup of house sparrows. When I was growing up in Maryland, the house sparrow was slammed as a bad bird. Not just pesky, belligerent, and meddlesome, but thuggish, known for molesting and displacing good birds, martins, robins, wrens, and, especially, bluebirds. It deserved the reputation. When one scientist, Patricia Gowdy, monitored bluebird boxes in South Carolina for 6 years in the late 1970s and early 1980s, she found 28 dead adult bluebirds inside the boxes. 20 of these showed violent trauma to the head or breast. In 18 the crown was bloody, denuded of feathers, and the skull cracked. She writes, house sparrows were observed at 18 of the 20 nest boxes on her visits before and after the deaths. Circumstantial evidence to be sure. Gowdy never caught a house sparrow in the act of hammering the head of a bluebird. But still, on 3 occasions, she discovered sparrow nests built over the bodies of victims. The right wing of one dead bluebird, she wrote, was stretched out and up and incorporated into the dome of the house sparrow's nest. The house sparrow may be rightly branded as a thug or feathered rat, stigmatized as pernicious, even murderous. But whatever people say, the bird is a superb invader, skilled at ensconcing itself nearly everywhere it goes. Of 39 known house sparrow introductions, 33 have been successful. For the past 15 years or so, Daniel Soule has been thinking about what makes a bird like the sparrow slip so easily into any place it goes. Soule, an ecologist at Spain's Center for Research on Ecology and Forestry Applications, calls it the invasion paradox. Why can alien species succeed in environments to which they have had no opportunity to adapt and even become more abundant than many native species? What gives some birds their edge in the face of radical change? Imagine that one day dozens of different exotic bird species outside their natural range escape from their cages. Sol can tell you which ones will likely be around in 20 years, squabbling around our park benches, squawking from colossal nests on telephone poles, gathering in massive flocks that darken the sky, displacing the native species. He bases his predictions on what he has gleaned from observing the common traits of invasive birds around the globe. In the past, scientists studying the invasion success of birds have focused on the influence of their nesting habits, migration patterns, clutch size, and body mass. Some years ago, Sol and his colleague Louis Lefebvre decided to see if brain size and intelligence might have anything to do with it. First, they looked at the records of invasive birds in and around New Zealand, a region that has suffered from the presence of exotics of all kinds. Of the 39 bird species introduced to New Zealand, 19 succeeded in overrunning it, the other 20 did not. When the duo studied the characteristics of the 19 introduced species that I took and those that failed to establish themselves, two pronounced differences emerged. The more successful invaders had larger brains. They also had more innovative, flexible behavior of the kind Lefebvre documented in his avian IQ scale. When Sol later looked at 428 bird species that invaded areas around the world, the pattern held. Successful colonizers were brainy and inventive. Well represented among the intruders were those kings of innovation, the corvids, the house crow in Africa, Singapore, and the Arabian Peninsula, the jungle crow in Japan, the common raven in the American Southwest. All big-brained, and all considered pests in the regions they had invaded. Successful amphibian and reptile colonists also have bigger brains than their less successful peers, as do mammals, including Homo sapiens, the so-called colonizing ape, invader of almost every land habitat on Earth. Big brains are costly in terms of development and maintenance. But they're thought to enhance a bird's survival by allowing it to rapidly adjust to unusual, novel, or complex ecological challenges such as finding new food or avoiding unfamiliar predators. It's called the cognitive buffer hypothesis. A big brain buffers an animal from environmental change by allowing it to adapt to novel resources, to try new foods and explore new objects and situations that a more programmed species might avoid. In other words, to be flexible enough to do things differently. For a bird to succeed in a novel or changed environment, says Sol, it must have a knack for doing something new. Ordinarily, there's not much nourishment for a bird around a parking lot or a skyscraper. In Normal, Illinois, however, two ecologists watched house sparrows working their way along a line of parked cars in a parking lot, gleaning insects trapped in the radiators. Sparrows have also been observed foraging for insects late at night, in the floodlights around the observation floor of the Empire State Building, 80 stories up, which goes to show, the observer noted, that Manhattan is not an. These are just a couple of pages from the house sparrow's book of tricks. In his tally of inventive bird behaviors, Louis Lefebvre studied 808 species. Many birds had only one innovation to their name. The house sparrow had 44. The sparrow is known for nesting in unusual places: rafters, gutters, roofs, soffits, attic vents, dryer vents, pipes, ductwork, you name it. A Missouri biologist discovered a truly novel nesting site when he noticed sparrows carrying food to a working oil pump in McPherson, Kansas. In inspecting the pumps, he found they contained 3 nests, all with young. 2 of the nests were in constant motion with each cycle of the pump, seesawing about 2 feet up and down every few seconds. Moreover, house sparrows line their nests with some unusual materials, feathers plucked from living birds, for instance, sometimes hundreds of them. In one week-long period in spring, an observer at Victoria University in Wellington, New Zealand, caught several sparrows in the act, collecting feathers directly from the rump area of an incubating adult pigeon, 6 or 7 an hour. Typically the sparrow would arrive on the ledge, he wrote, hop up onto the back of the pigeon, pull out a single contour feather and then fly away. In some cities, you can find smoked cigarette butts in sparrow nests, which effectively function as a parasite repellent. Butts from smoked cigarettes retain large amounts of nicotine and other toxic substances, including traces of pesticides that repel all kinds of harmful creepy crawlies, an apparently ingenious new use of materials. When it comes to foraging, house sparrows are particularly exploratory and inventive. They will go wherever the food is, no matter how foreign the place or the meal. They'll eat plant matter, primarily seeds, but also flowers, buds, and leaves, as well as insects, spiders, lizards, geckos, even an occasional young house mouse, not to mention a broad array of human refuse. And their foraging techniques are equally unconventional. Sparrows have been seen methodically plucking insects from spiderwebs straddling the railings along the River Avon in England. On the Hawaiian island of Maui, they've mastered the knack of pilfering morsels from the balconies of breakfasting tourists in the massive beachfront hotels. Instead of patrolling the hundreds of balconies facing the sea, the sparrows cling to the concrete walls between them and wait until breakfast is served. This saves the energy that might be expended flying to and fro to see who's eating breakfast or hovering before a balcony, waiting for the baked rolls to arrive. But perhaps their most famous Promethean feat is one that defied a fancy human invention. Some years ago, a pair of biologists watched with surprise and delight as house sparrows, in a New Zealand bus station, repeatedly opened an automatic sliding door that led to a cafeteria. The birds flew slowly past the sensor or hovered in front of it or landed on top of it, leaning forward and bending their necks until their heads triggered the sensor. They did this 16 times in 45 minutes. The new automatic door had been installed only 2 months earlier, but the sparrows had easily conquered its workings. The top of the sensor was covered with bird droppings. The trick popped up in other places around New Zealand. According to one account, a sparrow at the Dow's Art Museum in Lower Hutt, New Zealand, was seen opening a double set of automatic doors leading to the cafeteria. A few minutes later, the sparrow activated both sensors to return outside. Staff members at the cafeteria were familiar with the bird, having watched him trigger the sensors many times over the previous 9 months. Despite the presence of sparrows and automatic doors with the same system of sensors in many countries, the observers noted, they could find no reports of the deed anywhere but in New Zealand. It seems that either foreign ornithologists have not reported sightings, they wrote, or that. Compare all this with the ruddy turnstone, a small wading bird near the bottom of the innovative behavior totem pole. In his book The Winged Birds, Peter Matheson describes an early experiment on the shorebird's behavior by 18th-century English naturalist Mark Catesby. Catesby provided a ruddy turnstone with stones to turn, the better to observe the feeding trait that gives the bird its name. In a time when scientific experiments were less complex than they are today, the bird was furnished systematically with stones that had nothing beneath them, whereupon, not finding under them the usual food, it died. Most vertebrates are either fearful of strange objects or indifferent to them. But newfangledness of most kinds doesn't seem to faze a house sparrow. When Lynn Martin of the University of South Florida, Tampa, tested the sparrow's tolerance for novel objects such as a rubber ball and a toy plastic lizard, by placing them near seed-filled feeding cups, he discovered a surprise. The house sparrows were not only unperturbed by the strange objects, they actually seemed drawn to them, happier to approach the seed-filled dishes when ball or lizard was present. Martin noted that this was the first record of a novel object actually being attractive to a vertebrate. If you're going to invade a new place, a love of novelty helps. So does a fondness for hanging out in groups. Sparrows are gregarious. They don't like to eat alone. Or bathe alone. Or roost alone. They forage in flocks, calling in other birds to join them in feeding. They roost in congregations that vary in number from a few individuals to hundreds or, occasionally, even thousands. Group living offers clear advantages for sparrows, as it does for other birds. One is predator protection. Another is faster food finding. A bird arriving from a particular direction at a communal roost with a visibly full crop may point to profitable foraging areas as well as a quick travel route. Moreover, as it happens, larger groups of sparrows appear to solve problems more quickly than do individuals or small groups, at least according to recent work by Andris Leiker and Veronika Boccani of the University of Pannonia in Hungary. The pair found that squads of 6 birds easily and consistently beat out groups of 2 at opening a tricky seed container, a clear plexiglass box with holes drilled through the top. Each of the holes was covered by a lid with a small black rubber knob glued to it. To get at the seed, the sparrows had to either pull open the lid or vigorously peck it to detach it. The gaggles of 6 outperformed the pairs in every respect. They opened 4 times more lids, were 11 times faster at solving the problem, and got their seeds 7 times sooner. All in all, the bigger groups were about 10 times more successful than the pairs. The scientists chalked up the flock's greater successes to the odds that they included birds with varying abilities, experiences, and temperaments. Large groups succeed because they're more likely to contain a diverse range of individuals, the team writes, some of whom will be very good at problem solving. Research on other bird species confirms this. Among Arabian babblers, for instance, once one individual in the group learns a task, the rest learn it relatively quickly, says Amanda Ridley. New skills are more likely to be acquired in larger groups. This is true for humans, too. Studies show that small but varied groups of 3 to 5 people crack intellectual tasks faster than even the brightest individuals. Psychologist Steven Pinker goes so far as to argue that group living and the opportunity it offered our ancestors to learn from one another set the stage for the evolution of human-like intelligence. Invading birds are constantly encountering new and challenging situations that require novel solutions, which groups come up with more quickly than loners do. For species such as sparrows that live in habitats being continuously changed by humans, say the Hungarian scientists, 2 heads are definitely better than 1. There's a corollary to this: one house sparrow head is not necessarily like another. That animals are individuals may seem obvious to pet owners. But for a long time, variation among members of a single bird species was considered mere noise. Birds of a feather were expected to behave alike. There is a great tendency to see an animal do just what it is supposed to do, warned the ornithologist Edmund Sealis. But uniformity of action is in proportion to paucity of observation. The real naturalist should be a Boswell, and every creature should be, for him, a Dr. Johnson. Birds are individuals and respond individually to all sorts of situations, which cues they use to navigate, how they respond to oxytocin-like molecules, whether they seek extra-pair matings, how they react to novelty. Like us, they vary in character and behavior. I suspect these variable behaviors reside in what we call mind. But they also show up in the body, in the way a particular bird responds to stress, for instance. A stressful stimulus that elicits a big response in one bird may evoke a mere ruffled feather in another. For instance, John Cochrane of Massey University in New Zealand, who studies stress responses in little penguins and other birds, has found that individual birds diverge considerably in how they respond to environmental stressors. Again, these differences may be important to sparrows in adapting to novel or unstable environments. In dealing with, say, a big dangerous place like a city, it pays to mix it up. Lynn Martin has caught house sparrows in the act of infiltrating new territory, giving him a window on the traits that mark the plucky birds at the front line of an invasion. Martin, an ecological physiologist, studies the house sparrows now swarming over Kenya. The birds were first introduced to the coastal city of Mombasa in the 1950s, probably on ships coming from South Africa. Martin began studying them as a graduate student in 2002, when sparrows were rare in Kenya. Now they're common in cities all the way up to the Ugandan border. He and his colleagues consider the distance from Mombasa as a proxy for the age of the sparrow populations. They're looking at differences between the old populations at the original site of introduction and the new populations at the edge of the range expansion in cities such as Nairobi, Nakuru, and Kakamega. Birds farthest from Mombasa, at the cutting edge of invasion, have revved up immune systems. They also release more stress hormones known as corticosterones after being caught. The scientists suggest that the stress hormones allow the birds to react more quickly to stressors, survive them, and, perhaps, remember them. The pioneering sparrows also have a taste for new foods. When Martin's graduate student Andrea Liebel tested the birds on foods as foreign to them as freeze-dried strawberries and puppy chow, She found that the sparrows from older, more established populations would have nothing to do with the weird new foods, even when they were very hungry. In contrast, the leading birds, without a moment's hesitation, wolf down the berries and chow. At the edge of a bird's range, foods and other resources are likely to be novel, explains Liebel. So individuals that are open to trying new things have a big advantage. Otherwise, they might starve. If it's so advantageous to be open to the new and flexible in your eating and foraging habits, why don't all sparrows adopt these traits? Because they're risky. Flexibility carries costs. Curiosity may kill the bird as well as the cat. Exploring the new and unknown takes time and energy, and it can get you into trouble. Taste a new food and you take the chance of tasting a new toxin or pathogen along with it. Great blue herons are known for their experimental eating, taking in all kinds of large, cumbersome, or unwieldy prey, snakes, sticklebacks, sculpins, and other spiny fish. But one bird off the coast of Biloxi, Mississippi, lately broke new ground when he branched into the untested realm of elasmobranchs. It was a quiet November day. A group of scientists from the Dauphin Island Sea Lab saw a heron just off the coast striking something beneath the water again and again, without success. Then its head disappeared beneath the surface for a time and it emerged with an Atlantic stingray impaled on its beak. Lots of creatures eat elasmobranchs, including killer whales, fur seals, and a suite of sharks. But birds? The ray wriggled and whipped its tail and venomous spine back and forth in the heron's beak, said the scientists. After 12 minutes of struggle, the bird managed to fold the stingray tightly in its mouth, expand its esophagus, and swallow the thing whole, apparently without distress. A brown pelican found dead on the Baja coast tried the same trick but without success. The bird had the tail spine of a stingray embedded in its throat and had died, presumably, as a result of choking or poisoning. Proof that opportunism is a hazardous way of life, noted the observers. Kias, those clever, playful parrots endemic to New Zealand, will consume almost anything. They eat 100 species of plants, insects, eggs, seabird chicks, and animal carcasses, which may be one reason they survived the mass extinctions wrought by human settlement on the island. They even tasted the sheep introduced into their alpine habitat in the 1860s. At first feeding on dead sheep and then developing a new foraging strategy, riding on the backs of live sheep to feast directly on their fat and muscle tissue. The same traits that helped kias survive in a harsh environment for most of its evolutionary history have lately put them in harm's way. The sheep feeding innovation did not endear them to farmers, who placed a bounty on the birds, resulting in the deaths of an estimated 150,000 kias. The birds' investigative tendencies in ski fields, parking lots, and rubbish dumps often endanger the remaining 1,000 to 5,000 individuals. One kia in the alpine village of Mount Cook ran into trouble on account of his skill at opening the lids of trash cans. He was found dead with 20 grams of dark liquid material in his crop. The cause of death? Methylxanthine toxicity after opportunistic ingestion of dark chocolate. The point is that it's dangerous to explore the new and unknown. A strategy of seeking out and sampling alternative food or shelter may benefit a house sparrow as it's first settling in, when much of the environment is unfamiliar. But, as Lynn Martin suggests, eating new stuff increases the risks, including the risk of infection. Once the birds are established in a place, they may shift their strategy and stick with what's known. Again, it's advantageous to have a mix of personalities, some risk-takers to copy and some who play it safe. Here, then, is a recipe for the house sparrow's success. A taste for novelty, a pinch of the innovative, a dash of daring. Add to this its love of habitats that have become widespread on this planet and its ability to brood several times in a single breeding season. Put it all in the blender, and the upshot is a bird that's a consummate adapter, one that can easily switch to a new food or foraging strategy or an unorthodox nesting site. It's a different breed of genius. In this case, the measure of intelligence is the ability to change. Darwin didn't say that, but Einstein supposedly did. The house sparrow is not the only bird that has learned to love garbage and nest in drain pipes. A number of other species, pigeons, crows, a few small songbirds, are synanthropes, well suited to life in radically changed environments such as cities, which are rife with novel opportunities, as well as dangers such as cars, electrical lines, buildings, windows. Daniel Soule and his colleagues looked at 800 species around the world and identified a number that are, as Soule says, true urban exploiters that have attained higher densities in the cities than in the natural surroundings. These include members of the crow, blackbird, and pigeon families. The team also drummed up a list of the most common traits and behaviors that allow these birds to go to town. Chief among them are big brains and the ability to deal with strange foods, the hazards of traffic, perpetual light, and constant din. Among songbirds, for instance, musical accommodation is key. The will and ability to switch up your tunes. Cities hum, buzz, roar, and rumble in the lower frequencies. Canadian researchers recently found that when traffic noise is high, black-capped chickadees sing their Phoebe songs at higher frequencies so that they're heard over the low-frequency urban cacophony. When the din diminishes, they revert to their familiar lower, slower, more musical melody. The remarkable vocal flexibility exhibited by chickadees may be one reason that they thrive in urban environments, say the researchers. European robins get around urban sound by singing in the quieter night. Cities have been called learning machines. They may make smart birds even smarter. Who can't cope in the urban jungle? Those birds distinctly unsparrow-like, skittish, or set in their ways. The bird startled off the nest by human hustle and bustle or thrown for a loop by round-the-clock lighting. The small-brained, the inflexible, the specialist. The same is true for birds that live in farmlands, even those far from cities and suburbs. When scientists looked at trends in bird populations living in farmlands in the United Kingdom over a period of 30 years, they found dramatic declines in the small-brained species such as warblers and tree sparrows, while species with relatively large brains, such as magpies and tits, were still faring well. Birds that were most particular about their habits and their haunts seemed to be suffering the most. New insights from the farms and jungles of Central America confirm this. For a dozen years, biologists from Stanford University have been counting birds in 3 different types of habitat in Costa Rica: relatively pristine forest reserves, mixed to farmlands, and, finally, large, intensively farmed single-crop plantations of sugarcane or pineapple. Over a period of 12 years in 44 different transects, the team members counted 120,000 birds of 500 different species. The mixed farmlands, to their surprise, had as many species as the pristine forests. But the scientists were interested in more than simple species diversity. They wanted to know whether there was evolutionary diversity, birds from distant branches of the evolutionary tree. In the farmed landscapes, constantly disturbed and worked over by humans, most birds present were members of closely related species that adapt easily to change, primarily sparrows and blackbirds that had evolved as separate species only within the past couple of million years. Absent were representatives from branches far apart from these birds on the evolutionary tree, the great tinamou, for instance, a stocky, speckled, flightless bird that diverged from blackbirds and sparrows some 100 million years ago. This tinamou thrives only in a specialized jungle habitat, where its drab-brown and gray plumage blends in with the foliage. Though its eggs don't necessarily, they're renowned for their high gloss and spectacular colors, lime green, sky blue, and a coppery purple-brown. For those interested in preserving bird diversity, this raises an important question. Do smart, adaptive bird lineages such as sparrows and blackbirds evolve more rapidly, generating more new species? Research by Daniel Soule and his colleagues suggests this may be so. The number of species varies greatly among different groupings of birds. The Passerida has 3,556 species, while the Odontophoridae contains only 6 species. In taxonomic studies, Soule has shown that big-brained species that are innovative, adaptable, and good at invading new environments diversify at a speedier rate. This includes species-rich groups such as the corvids, parrots, and birds of prey, which have a capacity for quickly adjusting their feeding behavior. It's called the behavioral drive theory. The idea is this: individual birds that adopt a new habit expose themselves to a new set of selection pressures. These new pressures may favor certain genetic variations or mutations that improve a bird's effectiveness at living in a new way, or within a new context. Birds with these variations diverge from the rest of the population. In other words, novel behaviors foster novel traits, which produce new species. Over evolutionary time, then, opportunistic birds that can easily swap one food source for another or use a new foraging technique have generated more species than their less adaptable peers. This may go a long way toward explaining why there are close to 120 species of corvids and only a handful of ratites, flightless birds like the ostrich and the emu. It also begs the question of whether we humans, in creating novel and unstable environments, are changing the very nature of the bird family tree. Even on remote mountain peaks where the forest is pristine, birds of old lineages feel the ripple of human effects, not from the encroachment of cities and farms, but from something even more pervasive. In early 2014, two young researchers, Ben and Alexandra Freeman of Cornell University, found that 70% of the bird species living in the mountains of New Guinea, 87 species, had shifted their ranges upslope by an average of 500 feet or so in the past half-century, to escape rising temperatures from global warming. Ben Freeman is fascinated that most mountain birds in the tropics live at very narrow bands of elevation. I find it astonishing that I can walk uphill through forest where a given species is absent, to forest where that species is abundant, and finally to forest that again lacks the species, all in the course of 15 minutes of hard hiking, he says. This holds true despite the apparent sameness of the forest as he ascends, and the bird's ability to fly to higher or lower elevations. Is it a Goldilocks scenario, where other elevations are too hot or cold, he wonders. It seems so. On Mount Kerimui, an extinct volcano on the main island, the range of the magnificent bird of paradise had ascended more than 300 feet as a result of warming of just 0.7 degrees Fahrenheit, because a mountain is like a pyramid. Says Freeman, there's less area for habitat available as they move up the mountain. They're being squeezed both by temperatures and for space. The white-winged robin, for instance, which lived on the top 1,000 feet of a mountain 50 years ago, now wedges into just the top 400 feet. Temperatures in New Guinea are expected to rise another 4.5 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century. For species of birds in search of cooler temperatures have already reached the summit of Mount Kerimui and have nowhere else to go. These old lineage, specialized birds appear to be climbing their way to local extinction. Even a rise of another degree or two will push their thermal zone off that mountain and into the sky. Not far from where I live is a small mountain I like to visit, Buck's Elbow. Nothing exotic like Mount Kerimui, just an old Virginia hill. It's a place I go to for perspective and the wide-open views. The summit here is bare, almost like an Irish heath, and on a clear day offers a 360-degree panorama of the Appalachian Mountains around it. But this spring afternoon, the mountaintop is nested in cloud. A blanket of fog has rolled in, enshrouding the summit and muffling sound. The top of Buck's Elbow was always bald, but the slopes below were once forested in old growth, long ago cut over like so much original forest in the east.
I once saw a global map of human impact showing that only around 15% of the world's land area has escaped the human footprint. Towns and cities, farms, roads, nighttime light, they're everywhere but that thin slice of Earth's pie. And even where they are not, like Mount Kerimui, the planet is changing. Estimates put the rise in global temperatures at 3 to 7 degrees Fahrenheit over the next 60 years. In these parts, everything seems to bloom earlier than it used to. Maples open their shy white blossoms in mid-April. Yellow ladies' slippers unfurl on the mountain slopes nearly a month before they did in the past. Just a few days earlier, in a little park not far from here, I spotted a baby eastern bluebird on the limb of a locust tree. Roughly 2 or 3 weeks past hatching, he still had that goofy baby bird look, wide gaping mouth, short tail, spiky feathers sticking up from his head. The ornithologist with me was staggered. It's unheard of to have fledged baby bluebirds around here in April. It's too early for this. Virginia's climate is moving down latitude, as they say. According to projections by the Nature Conservancy, The state will be as hot as South Carolina by 2050, as hot as northern Florida 50 years after that. Rising temperatures are changing the schedules of resident birds. They're also shifting the range of temperate species toward the poles. 50 years ago, southern species such as cardinals and Carolina wrens were rare in the northeastern United States. Now they're common. When there is no other place to go, birds cope with rising temperatures in two ways, by evolving or by adjusting their behavior. Great tits, known for their behavioral flexibility, appear to have sorted this out, at least according to a long-term population study on the tits breeding in Wytham Woods. A team from Oxford showed that the short generation time of the tits allows them to evolve quickly, though not quickly enough. Critical to their survival is their ability to rapidly adjust their behavior. The great tits of those woods time the laying and hatching of their eggs to coincide with the spring peak of the moth caterpillars they feed to their young. The caterpillars emerge from their pupae with the blossoming of trees in spring, the timing of which is dictated by temperature. As temperatures have risen over the past half-century, tree blossoming and the caterpillar boom are occurring earlier than they did when the study began in 1960. If the tits were hardwired to lay their eggs at the same time every year, they would miss the caterpillar boom and their young would starve. But the birds have. The scientists' models suggest that this ability to adjust their behavior could allow the birds to survive a warming of 0.9 degrees Fahrenheit per year. Without it, the tits would face a 500-fold risk of extinction. When the researchers used the models to predict how other birds might handle the warming trends, they found that larger, longer-lived species fared worse. These birds have longer generation times, which means that they evolve more slowly, so they're more dependent on changing their behavior to survive. If these projections hold true, it may bode ill for bigger birds that score low on versatility. Long-distance migrants are particularly susceptible to global warming. These birds are largely small-brained and inflexible in their behavior. They depend on precisely timed, once-a-year blooms of food to fuel their breeding. If warming changes the traditional timing of food availability, chances are they'll suffer. Most vulnerable may be birds that breed or winter at high latitudes, where alterations brought about by climate change are expected to be especially severe. Many migratory birds also depend on precisely timed stopovers for feeding at critical points along their routes. Take the red knot, a bird of modest brain but prodigious travel. Each spring, it journeys 9,300 miles from Terra del Fuego to the Arctic. For thousands of years the red knot has relied for sustenance on a precisely timed rendezvous with horseshoe crabs laying their eggs on the beaches of the Delaware Bay. The eggs are so packed with fat that a red knot can double its body weight in just 10 days of feasting. Since the 1980s, the red knot population has dropped by 75%, largely because of overharvesting of horseshoe crabs. The harvesting has slowed of late, but climate change may deal the birds another blow. Crabs and birds must arrive simultaneously if the birds are going to make it to their nesting grounds in the Arctic. Shifting temperatures may throw the red knot out of sync with this food source so crucial to its annual marathon. If warming water temperatures cause the crabs to lay their eggs before the knots arrive, the birds will miss their vital feast. The truth is, relatively intelligent birds are also at risk. The mountain chickadee, for instance, a hardy little bird partial to mountain conifer forest. Its habitat is expected to dwindle by 65% over the next half-century. Moreover, global warming could in theory change the cognition and brain structure of this chickadee. Recall that chickadees living at higher elevations have bigger brains than do their peers living lower down. According to Vladimir Pravosudov, if the weather is warmer, winter will provide less selection pressure, so the birds may lose their edge, in both hippocampus size and intelligence. If maintaining better memory has costs, he argues, smarter birds will be at a disadvantage. Also, these populations will be quickly invaded by more southern, not so smart birds, which will lead to overall reduction in cognitive ability. Even the canny and adaptable house sparrow has its limits. In Ben Freeman's home city, Seattle, the 2014 Christmas bird count totaled just 225 house sparrows within the city limits. That's the lowest total ever, says Freeman, and one piece of evidence that house sparrows may be declining. Indeed, around the globe the bird is experiencing rapid and massive declines, in North America, Australia, and India, but especially in some towns and cities across Europe. Its decline generates few headlines, but the sparrow is now listed as a species of conservation concern in Europe. In Great Britain, it's red-listed. In the past half-century, the United Kingdom has lost an average of 50 house sparrows every hour. No one is certain why. The survival of nestlings appears to be the problem, perhaps because they're not getting enough food. Gardens converted to parking lots or low insect density because of exotic vegetation or pollution may be contributing, or perhaps it's due to the loss of parent birds to collisions with cars or predation by the growing numbers of domestic cats and city-loving raptors. Some evidence from Israel points the finger at climate change. Lynn Martin says he's skeptical of these theories, but he doesn't have a good explanation to offer in their stead. I wouldn't rule out disease of some sort, he says. Whatever the cause of their decline, if sparrows are the new canaries, ours is a troubled mine indeed. I sit for a while in the gray silence. The quiet on Buck's elbow is so complete I can hear my own breathing. In this gloom, it's hard to fathom the searing power of the sun's rays. But it's possible to imagine something else: songless woods, fields, mountains. The wisdom is that humanity is driving roughly half of all known life to extinction, including 1 in 4 species of birds. It appears to be mainly the specialists we're pushing out, the small-brained, the particular, the old lineages. The final paragraph of Ted Anderson's book on house sparrows is this: as I watch live television news from Baghdad, Gaza, Jerusalem, or Kosovo and hear sparrows chirping in the background, I sometimes wonder what opinion, if any, the house sparrow has about the havoc wreaked by its human hosts. I wonder, too. In their lifetime, my 2 daughters may witness birds of all minds ebbing into a sea that exists only in memory. We don't even know what we're losing. Scientists are still turning up new species, 2 kinds of hawk owls in the Philippines in 2012. One thought to be extinct because of widespread deforestation on the island of Cebu. And in 2014, the Sulawesi streaked flycatcher, a diminutive bird with a mottled throat and melodious song, hanging on in patches of tall forest left by farmers. And in 2015, the secretive little Sichuan bush warbler living in the dense brush and tea plantations of central China's mountainous provinces. Have other unknown species flown the coop before we even found them? We're still wondering how to define bird intelligence, still leaning heavily on human yardsticks. We can't help but measure other minds by their resemblance to our own. Naturally, we value what we're good at, tool-making, for instance, over true navigation. A new study suggests that crows exhibit an ability to grasp analogies, the sort of sophisticated understanding once thought solely the domain of humans and other primates. The experiment involved a pattern-matching game. Researchers trained 2 hooded crows to choose the card that looked exactly like a sample card, with correct answers rewarded by a mealworm concealed in a cup below the matching card. Then they asked the crows to do something new, to pick a card that didn't match the sample card but had the same pattern. For instance, if the card showed 2 squares of the same size, the crows had to match a card with 2 circles of the same size rather than one with, say, 2 circles of different sizes. The crows spontaneously picked the right card without any training, a premier example of analogical reasoning, say the researchers, one of our higher-level forms of thinking. This is a truly amazing demonstration of human-like mental powers. But shouldn't we also appreciate the complex cognitive abilities of birds in their own right and not because they look like some aspects of our own? Migratory birds may have small brains, But look at the colossal mental maps they carry. And consider the unique and enduring cultural traditions of songbirds. According to Richard Prim, the origin of song learning and culture in Austen songbirds occurred some 30 million or 40 million years ago, perhaps even predating the completion of the breakup of Gondwanaland, he writes. Although human culture is possibly 100,000 years old, songbirds have been doing aesthetic culture on a grand scale for tens of millions of years. We're still sorting out why some bird species seem smarter than others. Because they've had to solve problems around them, ecological, technical, or social? Because they've had to sing their hearts out or whip up a beautiful bower to win over a choosy mate? Intelligence as we understand it may vary among birds, but no bird is truly stupid. As the ornithologist Richard F. Johnston said, everything that is adaptive. Not miraculously, not flawlessly, but with its own kind of genius. And that includes the great Tinamou and the cog. I think back to my encounter with that cog in New Caledonia, heart thumping, camera dangling from my wrist. The ghostly bird, I've since learned, has large laser red eyes that help it spot prey in dim forest light. It raises just one chick a year. Once dogs were introduced, this reproductive pattern almost doomed it. But is the cog really that much dafter than the mockingbird that perched on Jefferson's shoulder to take food from his lips? A species poorly adapted to a new predator is not necessarily stupid. What we see as stupidity in the cog may be something more like ecological naivete, reflecting the bird's long-term adaptation to a once benign island environment. If you evolved with no predators and your food is found around ground level through direct pecking, your cognition will focus on food detection and accurate pecking rather than opportunistic foraging, explains Gavin Hunt. Who knows why quaggas often approach people and dogs? Perhaps it's because they don't like other quaggas on their patch of ground, so they investigate new arrivals and potential competitors. But now there are predators around. The quagga's world has changed, and the unavoidable truth for this bird and other old-timers is that their luck may be running out. It would be easy to give up on these birds, write them off as the collateral damage of human progress. But as one of the scientists who studied those Costa Rican farms and jungles said, having just sparrow-like birds in an ecosystem is like investing only in technology stocks. When the bubble bursts, you lose. In the gloam on Buck's elbow, there's a new, diffuse sort of light that makes the haze seem somehow illuminated from within. Suddenly, I hear a strange whooshing noise from nearby. 3 wild turkeys burst out of the fog and dash across the meadow before me, striding long-legged through the tall grasses like the small dinosaurs they are, then vanishing again like magic into the mist. A new study comparing the genomes of birds suggests that, genetically speaking, the turkey is closer to its dinosaur ancestors than any other bird is. Its chromosomes have undergone fewer changes than other birds since the days of feathered dinosaurs. Watching the gobblers steal away through the long grass, this is easy to believe. We almost lost our wild turkeys to the dinner platter in the past century. Arthur Cleveland Bent, writing in the 1930s, claimed that the few survivors had developed a high degree of shrewdness and cunning and gave an example noted by one Dr. J. M. Wheaton in 1882, as if aware that their safety depended on their preserving an incognito when observed. They affect the unconcern of their tame relatives so long as a threatened danger is passive or unavoidable. I have known them to remain quietly perched upon a fence while a team passed by. And one occasion knew a couple of hunters to be so confused by the actions of a flock of 5, which deliberately walked in front of them, mounted a fence, and disappeared leisurely over a low hill before they were able to decide them to be wild. No sooner were they out of sight, than they took to their legs and then to their wings, soon placing a wide valley between them and their now amazed and mortified pursuers. Not all the news is bad. The wild turkeys' numbers have since recovered, and now they're cropping up in greater numbers in every state except Alaska. Here they are enthusiasts of the oak and beech forests cloaking the mountain slopes. Like quaggas, they are ground foragers. And like Cognition, they are not considered the sharpest tacks in the drawer, Dr. Wheaton's story notwithstanding. But even a bird apparently short on brains can be big on presence. As Aldo Leopold reminds us in his riff on the physics of beauty, the autumn landscape in the North Woods is the land, plus a red maple, plus a ruffed grouse. In terms of conventional physics, the grouse represents only a millionth of either the mass or the energy of an acre, yet subtract the grouse and the whole thing is dead. The planet has had catastrophic species loss in the past. Out of cataclysmic events may come new creatures. Evidence suggests that the Big Bang radiation of species that occurred for songbirds, parrots, pigeons, and other birds took place after the mass extinction event on Earth about 66 million years ago that killed off the dinosaurs. On the scale of deep time, the sixth mass extinction may be one of many such events. But the measure that matters most to most of us is the measure of a human lifetime. It isn't necessarily comforting to think that nature may bounce back in a few million years or so. Moreover, while there may be even more than 10,000 species of birds down the evolutionary road, they won't be randomly descended from the species present today. Half may be from the genus Corvus, suggests Louis Lefebvre. People may be unhappy with that idea, Lefebvre told me. They think crows are plain and ornery. But who knows? In 2 million years, they could be colorful, beautiful singers. True. But who will be there to hear them sing? In the meantime, will we settle for diminishment, diversity reduced to sparrow-like species that play by our rules? Or will we strive to preserve the broadest possible swath of the avian tree of life, big-brained and small-brained, specialist and generalist? Old species and new? As a human being, Einstein once wrote, one has been endowed with just enough intelligence to be able to see clearly how utterly inadequate that intelligence is when confronted with what exists. We're still teasing out whether it pays for a bird to be smart, how and why and under what conditions intelligence may increase fitness. Do brighter individuals reproduce more? Oddly enough, evidence is scarcer than hen's teeth. Measuring the fitness benefits of a given trait in the real world is never easy, regardless of the trait, writes Sue Healy. Figuring out the link between bird cognition and fitness is a kind of golden goose in the field. It's tricky because the fitness benefits of a trait such as behavioral flexibility may be evident only in particular situations, says Daniel Soule, years when food is scarce, for instance. Under favorable conditions, the specialist may do better. There are trade-offs. Daniel Soule has data suggesting the existence of a trade-off between fecundity and survival. In general, smaller-brained birds have a larger clutch size, while larger-brained birds have a smaller clutch size. But the bigger-brained birds often have a higher rate of survival. It's a balancing act. Larger-brained birds have a slow life strategy, where the energy goes to survival rather than to reproduction, Soule explains. A long reproductive life can increase the productivity of these slow-living species, but they will never achieve the high productivity of fast-living species that prioritize reproduction over survival. On the other hand, he says, a fast life strategy can favor rapid population growth when conditions are favorable, but can be risky if they are not. When there are good and bad years, it may pay to have a slow life strategy, particularly if the bird has cognitive adaptations to survive in the bad years. In other words, says Soule, both strategies, living fast or living slow, can be more or less useful depending on the environment. What about within a species? Do more ingenious individuals have more young? There's conflicting evidence. One study of wild great tits on the island of Gotland in Sweden showed that parents that were speedier at a problem-solving task had a higher nestling survival rate than parents who couldn't solve the task. They had bigger clutches, hatched more eggs, and fledged more nestlings. However, in a close look at breeding pairs of great tits in Wytham Woods, Ella Cole of Oxford and her colleagues found that things may not be so simple. Smarter birds, Those that quickly solved a puzzle that required pulling a stick out of a feeder to release tasty treats, laid more eggs and foraged more efficiently, but they were also more likely to abandon their nests. In the end, it was a reproductive wash. In the wild, natural selection does not seem to favor problem-solver great tits over non-solvers, say the Oxford researchers. The problem solvers may produce bigger clutches because they're better at exploiting their environment, but they also tend to be more skittish about predators and more quickly abandon a nest. There could be a catch, though. As the scientists suggest in their paper, the nest failures for the tits may have been due to the experimenters trying to bring the chicks at too young an age. Were the good problem solvers, then, simply more sensitive to this artificial experimenter disturbance compared with the non-solvers, and deserted their nests more often because of it? Asks Niels Boogert. It would be very interesting to test whether these good problem solvers are also more sensitive to real predators, and thus more likely to abandon their nests, as the authors suggest, says Boogert. Without this experimenter disturbance factor, would the study have confirmed a positive relationship between problem-solving performance and reproductive success? The uncertainty goes to show how challenging it is to conduct these sorts of studies and how difficult it is to tease out all the variables. In any case, we may think of intelligence as universally advantageous, but it isn't always. There are trade-offs with any trait, including being a quick study and a fast learner. Bold birds that respond quickly to problems may suffer an accuracy trade-off as a result of their speed. On the island of Barbados, for instance, Simon Ducat has found that some Carib grackles are speedy problem solvers, while others are slower. In the end, the quicker wits tend to do worse on tests such as reversal learning than the slower, more accurate problem solvers. Bolder individuals tend to explore more quickly but more superficially, explains Daniel Soul. The slower explorers gain better information and use this to act with more flexibility. Why do both types persist within a population? Perhaps different types do better in their environment in different years, speculates Ducates, which may explain why cognitive ability varies from bird to bird. And why, as the sparrows have taught us, it pays to have a mix. The fog is lifting. I can begin to make out the undulant curtain of the Blue Ridge Mountains across the valley, purpled by the haze. From a grove of trees nearby comes the piercing zeet of a chickadee. I wander over, and there is the bird perched in a pine tree, rolling out its string of Ds, perhaps taking measure of my presence. One has only to consider the extraordinary genius packed tightly into that tiny puff of feathers to lay the mind wide open to the mysteries of a bird's knowing, the what and the why. These are wonderful puzzles to keep around on our intellectual bookshelf, to remind us how little we still know. Acknowledgements. I can't begin to thank adequately those who helped me make this book. I relied on the research of numerous scientists who have dedicated their lives to studying birds and their brains. Their names, and my debts to them, fill the book. I'm especially grateful to the following ornithologists, biologists, psychologists, and animal behavior specialists, who gave generously of their time and knowledge while I was researching the project. Louis Lefebvre of McGill University opened his lab to me at the Bellairs Research Institute in Barbados, and over the course of several days led me through the world of bird cognition, explaining his own research, offering thoughtful insights into the field as a whole, and answering my innumerable questions with patience, eloquence, and humor. He also read an early draft of the complete manuscript and provided helpful comments and suggestions. During my stay at Bellairs, Lee Michaelo, Jean-Nicolas Odette, and Simon Ducates were uniformly generous in sharing their research and ideas. When I visited New Caledonia, Alex Taylor of the University of Auckland spent many hours kindly and thoughtfully showing me various aspects of his work with the crows and offering his expertise on bird cognition. Elsa Louisel provided informative conversation, contacts, and companionship while hiking with me through the Parc des Grands Fauguères. She also supplied superb photographs of the Caugus we saw together, as well as landscapes of New Caledonia and its crows. Many other busy but generous individuals spent time talking with me, supplying me with references, and reading and rereading drafts of sections of the book exploring their work, including Lucy Applin of Oxford University, Gerald Borgia of the University of Maryland, John Endler of Deakin University in Victoria, Australia, Stephen Bruzet of Edinburgh University, John Hagstrom of the U.S. Geological Survey, Richard Holland of Queen's University, Belfast, Gavin Hunt of the University of Auckland, Eric Jarvis of Duke University, Jason Kiji of Michigan State University, Vladimir Pravosidov of the University of Nevada, Amanda Ridley of the University of Western Australia, and Daniel Soul of Spain's Center for Research on Ecology and Forestry Applications. Russell Gray of the University of Auckland kindly shared with me the videos of his brilliant Nijmegen lectures at the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics in 2014. I owe a large debt of gratitude to Nielch Boagert of the University of St. Andrews, who generously brought her scientific and editorial eye to bear on much of the manuscript, reading with great care and intelligence, some parts more than once. She made better every page she handled. Many other scientists from all over the world read portions of the manuscript and offered corrections on matters of scientific fact, rescuing me from all kinds of inky embarrassment. Warm thanks on this account to the following. In the United States, Arkatib Sanoff of Harvard University, Carlos Botero of Washington University, Nancy Burley of the University of California, Irvine, Lainey Day of the University of Mississippi, Judy Diamond of the University of Nebraska, Ben Freeman of Cornell University, Luke Frischkoff of Stanford University, Tim Gentner of the University of California, San Diego, Walter Herbranson of Whitman College, Lucia Jacobs of the University of California, Berkeley, Alan Camel of the University of Nebraska, Marcy Kingsbury of Indiana University, Sarah London of the University of Chicago, Lynn Martin of the University of South Florida, Tampa, John Mars Luff of the University of Washington, Shigeru Miyagawa of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Richard Mooney of Duke University, Gail Patricelli of the University of California, Davis, Irene Pepperberg of Harvard University, Lauren Riders of the University of Wisconsin, and Ranan J.D. West of the University of New. In the United Kingdom, Nicola Clayton of Cambridge University, Sue Healy of the University of St. Andrews, Richard Holland of Queen's University, Belfast, Laura Kelly of Cambridge University, Lyurka Stojic of Cambridge University, Christian Rutz of the University of St. Andrews, Murray Shanahan of Imperial College London, and Chris Templeton of the University of St. Andrews. In Europe, Alice Alversberg of the University of Vienna, Johann Beluas of Utrecht University, Jenny Olshader of Grafelfing, Germany, Henrik Murutsen of the University of Oldenburg, Andreas Nieder of the University of Tübingen, Niels Rattenborg of the Max Planck Institute for Ornithology, and Sabine Tubik of the University of Vienna. In Australia and New Zealand, Russell Gray, Gavin Hunt, and Alex Taylor of the University of Auckland, and Teresa E. Iglesias of Macquarie University in Australia. And elsewhere, Laure Cochard of the University of Montreal, Susana Herculano Ausel of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, Kazuo Okanoya of the University of Tokyo, and Shigeru Watanabe of Keio University in Tokyo. The comments and criticisms of these experts were hugely important in getting me back on track where I had wobbled off the rails. Any lingering mistakes that may still lurk in these pages are clearly and completely mine. Many friends and colleagues offered invaluable help or buoyed my spirits with their interest in my work. When I overheard Karen Bendel telling a friend about her African grey parrot, Throckmorton, she met my curiosity with kindness and generously shared stories of Throckmorton and of her pet cockatiel, Isabeau. Barry Pollock did the same, offering tales of her gray, Alfie. Michelle and Joey Mangum let me spend an afternoon on their wool farm in the company of Luke, Joey's monk parakeet, who obligingly sat on my shoulder and periodically leaned into my ear to say, "Whisper, whisper, whisper." Daniel Beaker, a gifted teacher and ornithologist, guided my fellow field ornithology students and me on outings and gave me a refined appreciation for birdsong. He also read the entire manuscript with an eye to the accuracy of the bird observations. David White, an experienced birder, shared stories, humor, and expertise. My dear friend Miriam Nelson has had a hand in many of my books, sometimes as a colleague or co-author, but more often for no other reason than generosity and friendship. She read an early draft of the manuscript